Today, I have something a little bit out of the ordinary. We're usually dealing with the big, giant, furry guys that leave the huge, enormous tracks and stinky smell and scare people. And but they're not the only cryptids out there. There's other things out there, too. And some of them can be even scarier, and not because they're big, but because they're little. And sometimes I like to refer to these guys as microfoot. They can be called little people. The interesting thing about these guys is there's legends from them all over the world too. Every culture, every continent. There's legends from the locals that, yeah, there were little people here, and they have all these interesting attributes. And every area they've got a different name for them, and they give them a little bit slightly different things that they maybe can do and whatnot. But there's a lot of things that are similar there too. And with Bigfoot, you always have the naysayers and the skeptics saying, "Well, there's no such thing as Bigfoot. Nobody's ever found a skeleton." Well, nobody's ever found a gorilla skeleton either. That didn't stop them from existing. But on the other hand, we have found little people skeletons. We have the Hobbit skeleton, the Homo florenziensis from the Isle of Flores. And if they were on that one little island, and apparently they found more skeletons of them elsewhere recently here, what's to have stopped them from going all over the place everywhere else? And, from what I can figure out, it sounds like their relatives, at the very least, probably did go all over the place everywhere else. So tonight's show, I'm really happy. We've got somebody on here whose family has had experience with the locals in their area, which is in Wyoming and Montana. And I am very, very fortunate, like I said, to have somebody who's actually had a background in these things. And for the purposes of the show, we're going to refer to them as Pedro, which is a reference to the Pedro Mountains mummy, which was discovered in the 1930s, all 18 inches tall of them. And that's the same little guys that we're talking about here. So when we say Pedro, that's who we're talking about. And now that we got that definition out of the way, I'd like to bring on our guest for this show, who I'm super pleased I finally managed to get on the show, and really looking forward to talking about this. Sue, welcome aboard.
Yes, I'm glad to be here to tell my story.
Now, these stories actually go back a long ways, but the first time you heard them, you were just a little kid yourself. You were like, what, 5 years old?
Yes, I was 5 years old, and it was regarding my grandma's father, which is my great-grandma's dad. And he was a native that from our original homelands, and he interacted with these Pedro, and then later on, we've seen them time to time in each generation, but it's in our, where we family lands are. But we prefer not to see them. We don't consider them. We consider them to be bad omens if we see them. We think that something terrible or sickness or something might happen to us if we happen to see them. Or even if we don't see them, but we know that it's them that, have interacted with us. And so we're pretty cautious about even mentioning too many things about it. And
part of my background is from the Irish, and they have the legends of the same things, the little people, the wee folk as they call them, and they got the fairies, and probably the one that you've heard about that's pretty famous here in the U.S., but not so much over there actually, is leprechauns. And leprechauns are about the same size, and they've got the same kind of sort of weird thing that follows them around as being like malicious, malevolent little spirits. If they're around, it generally means something bad's going to happen. You shouldn't really trust them. They're dangerous. And, it's just odd that here they are on the other side of the ocean. They're about the same size, and they have the same size attributed to them.
Yes, and what they look like, they're probably about, maybe about 1 to 2 feet, maybe even 3 feet. They're about as big as a toddler, I guess. And they're also very strong. And the ones that we know about have, they're called keepers of the earth, and they live underground, and their underground cities are, I think they live in like some kind of cities or something, because there's a lot of them, and they live in the rocks. Actually, they have portals that open up when they go back and forth into their, I don't know if you would call it a dimension, but our first interaction with them is prior to when the white man came to the native lands, and we had people that, this is one of our legends, where we had a man who shot into long, kind of straggly hair. Their faces are kind of like kind of messed up, and they like their nose might be kind of off. They have like kind of like scar looking skin and rough kind of skin, and they're also very strong, and they also have fangs. They have real sharp fang-like teeth, and they're really strong, and they are known to carry elk and deer on their backs, and they're known to butcher a large animal fast. Their teeth and their strength. And this is how my family history experience those characteristics of Pedro, because my great grandfather, who used to live out in the mountains by himself, watching our
So now at the point where you had actually first found out about these things, you were just a little kid, you were 5 years old, and they weren't telling you this story to like scare you to bed or something. You were overhearing a conversation that you shouldn't have been listening to, maybe.
Yes, I was. I was actually laying on the couch, and the adults were in the kitchen, and the couch isn't really that far from the kitchen table. And I was supposedly going to sleep, but I just laid there and closed my eyes and was listening to their conversation. And I remember the adults started talking about Pedro, and how we had visitors that evening, and while they were sitting around the kitchen table drinking coffee and eating treats and stuff, I was laying on the couch listening to them, and my grandma and my grandfather were discussing. The visitors that were there wanted to hear some stories about Pedro and what they knew about it. And so my grandfather, not my great-grandfather that interacted with them, but the grandfather, that was his father-in-law. And he started talking about how he interacted with them. And he said that his father-in-law was in a cabin out in the mountains, and he was kind of surrounded by canyons, and there was one way in there, and he stayed there year-round during the winter and everything, and the only way he could come back would be to ride horses out of there, and he would have to go down a canyon to come home. But his son, he would put a light outside of that cabin door to signal his son at night that he wanted his son to go to the other side of that. That was the only communication he had with anyone. And he didn't mind staying there. He enjoyed it. And all he did was just ride his horse from there. He might kill a deer. And one evening he came back from riding, and he got done eating, and then he took a lot of canned goods because he didn't have a refrigerator, and so he opened a can of peaches, and he had some coffee, made some coffee, and he sat outside outside of that little cabin on a chair, and he started eating some of that, the peaches, and drinking his coffee, and then he used to roll his own cigarettes. And he rolled his own cigarette, and he had a can there and some kind of like papers and stuff, how the old-fashioned way, I guess. And he was doing that. He ate some of this. He put that can down kind of by his feet, and then he started messing around with his cigarette, or rolling his cigarette or tobacco. And then he noticed something on the corner of his eye standing there watching him. And then he thought, oh, it must be one of those, like a smaller animal, maybe a raccoon or something. He turned around and looked at it, and it was Pedro. He looked at that can of peaches and wanted it. And so my grandpa gave him that can, and he ate the whole thing in a matter of seconds. He like inhaled that food, and my grandpa was watching him chewing those peaches, and he noticed he had fangs, and that kind of creeped him out. But he didn't want to do anything to get that thing riled up or anything, because we already have our legends about them. And so he talked to him in the old language, and which isn't the same as that we talk now. It's an older language, and somehow Pedro let him know that he had to leave now and that he'll be back, and he wanted some more of that sweet stuff. And so my grandpa said that he had several cans of that stuff, so he said yes. And so he said he seemed like he just disappeared. And then he got up and went around that corner to look around, and he didn't see him or anything. He
didn't like actually run off or anything. He just more or less like vanished.
I guess he just left fast, like.
Okay, so he did take off fast. Boom, gone.
Yeah, fast.
Okay.
And so my grandpa walked around that cabin, looked around that area, went to the horse corral and looked around there, and he didn't see that Pedro anywhere. So then he just went to bed because it was dark. I mean, it was dark by then. And so he made sure that he had enough of that stuff, because he was kind of afraid of what that thing would do.
God, I would be too. I mean, he may not be very big, but he's got fangs.
Yeah. And so he didn't know what he really wanted, why he came to him. And when you see something weird like that, you have to start praying and off your family and stuff. When you see something weird that's out of the ordinary. And so,
was there any legends in the tribe that said that interacting with these things was dangerous and bad? Or was this just the impression that he got?
Both.
Okay.
That they were not to be trusted, and they were like tricksters, and that they were not exactly friendly to man. They were kind of dangerous, and you couldn't trust them. And if you seen them, or even knew that that it might be them playing tricks on you, but you didn't see them, even that is a bad omen, and you had to like stay home for a while, pray, maybe even fast, and not try to stay home and not go do any kind of major activity or anything.
Right. Because it might just be a bad sign that something, that you're about to have some bad luck, something really bad might happen to you. So it's better to, take it safe for a while just in case.
Yes, that's how we view things like that. When we see something weird or something that's not right, it's best not to go do any kind of major decisions or do any of that kind of stuff.
Right. I know what you're saying. It's like
sorry. So
yeah, like a bad omen. And again, that goes back to the same thing that in the Irish folklore with the fairy folk and stuff. Like if you hear the wail of the banshee, somebody's going to die. If you think the leprechauns are around or something, they're dangerous, man. We've got this cute cuddly thing with leprechauns that we think, no, that's not what the original legends were like with these little guys. People didn't want them around. They were surly and nasty and foul-tempered and not to be trusted. So it sounds really similar to the description of what you're giving here.
Yeah, they just don't dress the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Local clothes are different. Other than that, they're probably the same critter, right?
I think so.
Well, so this is scary. So you're laying there as a little kid on this couch listening to the story that the adults are telling, straight-faced. Now, what are the ones that asked for this story to be told? What's their reaction to it?
I noticed that they were shaking their heads and that they were almost like whispering. Because, as we said, we can't say their name out loud or else they'll come.
Right.
And so because of that, they were starting to whisper. And I had to hear even more. I mean, I had to really strain my hearing to really listen to the next parts. Because it was interesting, very interesting. And so, and then I started getting the creeps myself laying there with it. I mean, all of that. I was kind of getting the creeps listening to that stuff. And so I started getting kind of scared, but I went ahead and listened anyways because my curiosity was just getting
the best of you. Yeah. I probably would have done the same thing too. I'd be like, oh, I shouldn't be listening to this. I'm really scared, but I want to hear some more. But this is really scary, but I want to hear some more.
Yeah. And so he, it wasn't the very next day or anything. It was maybe a week or two later that Pedro came for a visit again. And this time he brought his friend.
Oh, God.
There was a second Pedro there, and he looked basically the same. He looked the same. They both had ugly faces with fangs. And his friend wanted a taste of that, the peaches, canned peaches. And so then he went in and got some out and fixed it for them. And that one wanted another can. And so he got out 2 cans, I think. And then his can of tobacco was right there by his feet. He was sitting there. That was kind of his usual habit, was to smoke his homemade cigarettes, I guess, drink his coffee, and kind of relax there before he went to bed. Because he had to and then he would sit there and turn on his lanterns, the gas lanterns.
Mm-hmm.
And he would sit there and just relax and look out into the valley and just look around. And it was usually pretty quiet. And I'm pretty sure he didn't have a dog or anything like that. And because so if there was like a bear or something like that, it was usually his horse that let him know something was out there, maybe even lions or something. So he usually had his gun, right there just in case something like that came around. So he was, able to defend himself if he had to. And so,
did the horse react to the Pedros when they came around ever? Did he say anything about that?
No, I don't remember that.
That'd be interesting if someone mentioned that.
Because the horses can see this thing.
Right. That's why I was just curious if you didn't have a dog around there. If you had a horse, the horse might have been aware that they were around too. Yeah.
And the dog or that horse might have knew they were around and started getting used to them.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, that can of tobacco was right there by his feet, and he set those 2 cans down too, kind of near it. And so the second Pedro grabbed that can of tobacco and swallowed some of it, and almost choked on it. And started and gasping and everything, and my grandpa had to hit him on the back a couple times, and then he started like almost throwing up or something, and then he grabbed his coffee and drank that real quick, and then they both took off real fast. It seemed like they just kind of like turn and run or something so fast that he's kind of like amused at how quick they were. Mm-hmm. They didn't come back for a while because of that, what that other second one did. And then later and then this had to have been in the fall. So I think he came off the mountain like maybe once a month or something to get supplies, and he had pack horses, and he just because he had to get like groceries and stuff like that, and so he wasn't really didn't really need meat too much because he just killed the deer and elk around there, but he needed other stuff. So then he left and came back, and then the winter came, and it started snowing, and it was like a blizzard, and it's way severe in the mountains than and then for 2 weeks there was like a blizzard, and it was like below zero weather, and my grandpa couldn't go out to really hunt, and he had to move his he built some kind of a thing. It sounded like he built some kind of a thing near to keep his horse, so he didn't lose those horses. He had to kind of make like a lean-to thing.
Yeah, lean-to or shed or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He had to, and I think his sons, I think they took a lot of hay to him for his horses, because he didn't have, it looked like he was running out of, I think he did run out of meat, but he had some canned goods in there, like corn and some other stuff, but he preferred meat. And so I think those things went in his cabin and looked at his stuff at night while he was asleep. And then one morning, he got up and opened the door and got some firewood and started up his wood stove, and was gonna, he started making coffee and just gonna see what kind of food he had. And then he heard something hit the side of the door or something. Then he thought, what the heck is that? So he went, looked, and there was a deer laying there that Pedro and I think that other one killed. And he said it looked like it was killed by an arrow, little arrows, but it looked like they were really accurate where they shot it. And that, because he looked at it when he was skinning it, and he was like, how did this thing die? If it died naturally, or is it sick, or what? You can't just eat anything.
Yeah.
And so, and he noticed that it did have wounds on it. around the lungs and stuff. And so,
just to digress for a quick sec, legend has it that they use poison water.
I don't know about that, but
it was like a heart shot or something, and you got a poison weapon. You place it that close to the heart, boom, the poison goes into the heart, it dies right away.
I'm not sure if it had, but he noticed that it looked like it had some kind of arrows or arrowhead that killed it. And so then he gutted it and took the meat from it and, started drying some of it and then started eating. And then, and that kind of saved he didn't want to go out, and he was kind of afraid to really go too far because that blizzard and the snow was too deep.
Yeah.
And he didn't think the deer were going to be that high up. They would have to bed down in the timber, and the timber was quite a ways away, and the snow was too deep, and so when he finally did come down, he told his sons, because they're usually the ones that have the vehicles and the horse trailer to pick him up. And so when he finally got home, and he lived with with me and my grandma and my grandpa and my aunt. And so, but his sons were the ones that helped him with his horses and stuff. And that's why they were talking about some of that stuff, that he might have died at that. He might have already died then, but I remember him because I lived with him maybe 5 until I was maybe 5, and so it seemed like he might have passed away, and then that they were kind of mentioning him and what he's seen in his lifetime, and so they started talking about that story. And then he told his sons and my grandma, and so they were kind of afraid. They started getting afraid, and they started making preparations for like prayer and having things that we normally do for that in our culture.
Right.
And so and they kind of didn't want him to go back up there because he's about 70 some years old, or maybe even older, because I want to say he might have been born in the 1870s or something, 1880s, somewhere around there.
So this was like in the early 1950s when this happened?
Yeah, and so he had to have been, his kids were adults with kids of their own.
Right.
And I was a great-grandkid. And so, and I had
one, but yeah.
were older than me. Yeah. And so, because of that, they didn't really want him to go back up there, being there. And so, and I think I think they talked him into not going back up there. But, and I think he did quit that job, and they hired some other people that were younger than him to take over that job. And I don't know if anything happened with them or anything, but I remember one time when I was a little girl, I had to have been about 4, and we went to that canyon where you can see that cabin from the canyon. You have to go to the rim to see it, but I remember he had a car, and he would drive his car to the edge of the canyon, walk down, I don't know how many miles, it's like maybe a mile down or something. It was a long ways walking down, and he would with him there, but they seemed to know him. And to me, it seemed like he wasn't really afraid of them anymore after they brought that deer to him.
Saved them during the blizzard, yeah.
And I think he might have wanted to interact with them because they knew that language he spoke. No, there wasn't too many elders that spoke that language, but there was a couple of words that he could not understand, meaning that those things lived a long time or something. Oh, I forgot that part where they came back. That other one came back before the little accident happened.
Right.
That other one grabbed that tobacco. He started trying to communicate with them by doing sign language, using older words, and then then he asked them where they lived, and he said, "Do you want us to show you?" And he shook his head, "Yes." And he said, "Follow us then." And then he followed them to some rocks that were further, I don't know, maybe it wasn't right there near the cabin. It was on the edge of the canyon. And he had to walk a ways to get to there. He followed them, and there was a canyon there, and he said, "That's the way to go in to our village," meaning that there was more of them down there. And it was, to him, it sounded like the way they described it was that it was like a city-like place. And he said, "Can I go in and look?" And they said, "If you go with us, if we take you, you can't come back ever." But they gave him a choice to stay or go, meaning he would have to die.
Mm-hmm.
And he would go down there into that place.
There's pretty much the identical legend of the fairy folk over in Europe. If they take you into one of their little mounds or their barrows to go visit them, generally you never come back again. If you're so lucky that they release you, it's usually a year.
Yeah, to me it seemed like they didn't, the way it sounded. Oh, and then he said, "No, I have family. I have to stay here for my family. I don't want to do that to them." And they said, "Okay, then go back to your cabin. We won't come back anymore," or something like that. "We won't bother you," or something. They had some kind of weird agreement. And I think the reason why he would go down to that canyon to fish is just in case they did interact with him again. He must have had a curiosity about him, like he wanted to know more about him or about them.
Yeah, I could actually see that. If you could communicate with them a little bit, it would make it like really hard to not be curious about it and want to find out more about them. So now this is the few words that he could understand that they were speaking. This was in your native language, but like an older version of it?
Yeah, like an ancient language. And only he could understand some of it, but not all of it. And they did talk, but they had a kind of like a he said there, it was kind of like a gravelly sound. It wasn't clear like how you and I talk.
Mm-hmm.
It was like somebody who had a strep throat or a sore throat, and you know how they can't talk or they're sick.
Right.
He said that's how they talk, and it was kind of hard to understand.
Or that maybe they just habitually gargle with handfuls of gravel, you know.
No.
Those little guys just creep me out so much. The more I hear about them, the more it creeps me out. And the fact that, like, a lot of the things that you're bringing up right now match exactly with European legend about the same little guys over there. And how is that even possible? I mean, really, come on. If these guys are imaginary, there's no way that all those little details would be the same.
They're not imaginary.
Oh, there you go. They're not imaginary.
Yeah.
And there's so few people that have interaction with them and that are ever willing to come forward and talk about it. There's very few people that ever even see them. much less get a chance to actually interact with them, which is why I thought it was just so spectacularly interesting, and I wanted to have you on the show so much to talk about that. So now, after your great grandpa passed, was there any more people in your family that ever had any kind of interactions or sightings with these little guys again?
Yes, and it was, I don't know how my younger sister, her little girl would see them. And they were in her house. They were in that hallway where, toward the bedrooms, and there's a kitchen, and then there's the living room. And so she was, I don't know, maybe 5 or so, 4 or 5. And then she would say, there goes that little guy, or she would say, there goes that little guy, or something like that. And my sister would like, where? And she would point to it. And then when my sister went, looked over there and walked over there, turned on all the lights, looked around, there was nothing there. And so that kind of creeped my sister out. And then at my parents', which is probably about 10 miles away from there, they would go over there, and then my aunt, on my dad's side, her son would play with my nephew, and they would ride bikes by the creek, and there was like a picnic area where we always have like barbecues, family get-togethers and stuff. And there's like a little hill there, kind of goes down, and they like to ride their bikes up and down that thing. And then it's probably a quarter of a mile to my dad's house. And so they would be doing that, it's broad daylight. And then that my aunt's son, who was I think he was about 6 or 7, he seen one of them standing in the weeds, and that freaked him out, and he just screamed and went really fast on his bike, ran in the house, grabbed his mom and said, we have to go now. I cannot stay here. You gotta go. I can't see that thing.
Wow.
Nephew was right there, but he didn't see it. And he was like, but that really scared him. And so after that, he never went to my dad's home. He might have went there maybe once, but he stayed right next to his mom. Didn't want to play even outside. He stayed right next to his mom, and he kind of wanted his mom to hold him, even though he was like an 8-year-old. And
wow.
He was that scared of him. And then after that, then the next time we were at our a tribal get together, and we camp out. And so I I wasn't there because I had to work, so I couldn't go to it until I only go during the weekend. But my sister could go there because she lived nearby. She lives closer to that than I did, my parents. And while it was in the evening. No, it was dark already, and they were the first ones to stay at the campground. I mean, there was a bunch of other people there. There was like maybe 500 people camped there. There was a lot of people.
Wow, yeah, good sized camp out.
Their camp was like right in the middle. They weren't on the edge or anything. They were right in the middle, but there was, bushes and trees right around there. And then my niece seen one, and her dad seen it. But my sister, I can't remember if my sister seen it, because she was telling me about it the next day, and she was creeped out by it. And then the next day, my dad and all the rest of the family came, and they, started camping there. And so she didn't feel threatened at all after that while we were all there. But when they were there, I think my brother was there that night too, but he didn't see anything. And it was just them that saw it, and it ran behind one of the tents and stuff. And
Did they say it could move? You know, it had like super fast movement, like
it had
what great grandpa.
fast speed too. And then I thought,
That seems to be common from the
like
few reports that I've heard of them.
yeah, I think it must have followed them from their home. It must have got in with their stuff, and then so it must have been around there. And since then, my sister, I don't think she's interacted or seen any of that stuff anymore after that, but she's kind of careful. She doesn't really want to see it. She prays against it.
Yeah, I could see why.
Yeah.
Now, do you have like a general taboo, or is there some sort of a legend revolving around them not touching you?
Yeah, it's, or any kind of thing that isn't quite,
Ordinary?
yeah, that it's generally regarded as something terrible could happen to you, or not, or within the household, not necessarily you, but could happen within the household too. But it's like an omen. You don't want them to. It's just like somebody, like a murderer touching you would be equal to that.
Right.
You don't want anybody like that, especially if you know they're guilty of the crime,
Right.
to touch you,
Right.
And it transfers evil spirits to you.
Motoring right along here now. So you've been through a bunch of different encounters here, including your great grandpa and some other members of your family. In general, are there quite a few people in your tribe that have actually like had encounters with these things, seen them, or anything like that?
I used to hear a few stories about like teenagers seeing them on the middle of the road at night, on desolate roads. Well, those were the only things I remember within the last 20 years. They, some of them happened right around here where I lived, and then some in where these teenagers would, go out to party at some desolate spot. There's a group of them, and they're acting real good, and then suddenly they see one of those things, and they freak out, and they call the cops.
Yeah.
They're trying to hide from the cops in the first place, but they call the cops. I run to the jail or something. I see them run to the
Come bust us. There's some weird thing here.
Yeah. So there's hardly any traffic on these country roads around here. And haven't really, like I said, we don't generally discuss these sightings. Families handle that sighting in their own way. They don't advertise it. They keep it hidden.
Is there any, even like old legends or stories or anything about these things having bad, like attacking people or stealing livestock or anything along those lines? It's like you hear this sort of thing being done by Bigfoot occasionally. Just kind of wondering if you heard any of the same kind of legends about Pedros.
No. I don't think people really attribute any kind of like maybe cattle mutilation to them, but they are known to be strong, and they do take down large animals. And this is from previous legends before the white man came on the scene. We've known those characteristics, but like I said, people, if they seen something like that, they normally don't tell anybody. Maybe
Right.
a select few members of their family to be careful outside when they're out working with animals or anything. And so normally we don't hardly hear any of that stuff. Only if someone in that family whispers it,
Right. Tells it to some other family member.
Yeah, and And it's usually a warning not to go into a certain area. Like, you know, don't go over there. We've seen this over there. Or somebody, this lady, where she was riding horses, and it was near the foot of the mountains, or maybe it was in the mountains. I think it might have been very close to the mountains. And the lady was at a reservoir, and she was moving cattle, and her husband told her to just wait there for him, because he was bringing some more down. Then they were going to take them further to where they needed to go. And so she kind of hung around that reservoir and made sure the ones she got didn't just tick off. So she was just looking around and enjoying the scenery. Then all of a sudden she heard a voice kind of behind her saying something like, in our native language, "You're very pretty." And then she turned around, and it was one of them, Pedro. And he looked the same way I described what my great-grandfather seen. And then she freaked. And I think her horse started freaking, and they just took off at a dead run. And she was screaming her head off, and I think her husband must have heard it, and he ran toward that way. And she said she had to leave. She had to go into town. She could not be out there with that thing. And but that lady obviously overcame her fear. I think really watch her when they go out. And so they do live out there. They live way out there. And I think she's probably still has that kind of stuff, you know, at the back of her mind, and she's probably careful about it. But this was in broad daylight, like in the afternoon. It wasn't at night or evening or anything. It was like flat out daylight where she could look at that thing.
God.
And hear just the sun.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. It's not night. You can't convince yourself that it was just a trick of shadow or something. It's right there in the daylight. Pretty obvious. You know, that makes it extra terrifying. And then there's the other, they're not afraid of the light, because there it is in the daylight. You know, getting back to the strong thing, you mentioned that like 3 times out of the gate. You were talking about the attributes of these things. You brought up strong 3 times. And I had heard several stories about that before we ever got in contact with each other. And of course, one was the classic story about the brave who shot the elk. The elk ran off and died. And by the time he caught up with it, one of the Pedros had already found it and had the head over his shoulder and was dragging the whole elk away. Which, you know, at that point, the brave had enough common sense to just let well enough alone and get the heck out of there while he still had the opportunity to do so. And the other story that I heard is that there was a hunting party out, and one of them heard some weird noise and woke him up in the middle of the night while everybody else is still sleeping. He got up to go see what it was, and not too far away, there was an argument going on between a Bigfoot and a Pedro over some animal they had killed. And that apparently the Pedro won the argument and got to keep the animal. Bigfoot lost. Yeah, no kidding. That one really scared me. It's like, okay, Bigfoot backs down to Pedro's. That's like a grizzly running from a wolverine, you know, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Like now you know what the pecking order is.
Yeah, and if there's like about 100 of them attacking like a Bigfoot, they can.
I mean, even as strong as Bigfoot is, if one of these little guys could pick up an elk, you know, my God, a couple of them could probably. Pretty well beat the snot out of Bigfoot.
Yeah, I think so. And they do live in the same areas.
Yeah.
So they have some kind of pecking order there.
Yep. You know, and that's the interesting thing to me when I moved out to this area where I had come from. The areas I had lived in previously didn't have much in the way of legends about the little people. And when I got out here, I started noticing that not only were there the stories around, but they were in almost exactly the same places where Bigfoot was supposed to be. And in some places, there was like a triple threat thing going on. There was like abandoned mines or ghost towns that were also getting Bigfoot sightings. That were also getting sightings of Pedros. So, some of these make some of these places really undesirable as tourist attractions. Let's just put it that way. Unless you're there to go see monsters, you're not going to want to go there at all. But I just found that really odd that there does seem to be that kind of overlap. Like these things are inhabiting sort of the same territory, so there must be some sort of interaction that goes on with them from time to time. And they probably pretty well got figured out who's in charge in what situation, I would guess. Anyway.
Yeah, I personally believe that they are Nephilim creatures, and they belong on the other team.
See, that wouldn't surprise me at all, because that's one of my pet theories for Bigfoot and a lot of these cryptids is that they were made by the Nephilim to be servitor races for them a long, long time ago, and there's still some of them left around. And, most of these types of critters that you hear about, they live underground. That's the same place the giants live. Take note of that. They all seem to live underground. And it's a lot easier to hide underground, too. You got to give them credit for being smart there. But, the whole thing to me is just, it's an extra layer of creepy that I didn't need. I mean, I've seen Bigfoot. I haven't seen a little person, and I'm hoping that I never actually do. But, having found tracks at that one point when I was out there by the ghost town of Coloma and outside of the town in an area where just no one ever goes. There's no way to get there other than on foot. And it's about 1.5 miles in the middle of nowhere. And you find tracks that look like a human toddler wearing moccasins. Well, damn good and well there's no mom with a toddler out there walking the kid around in this slag heap in the middle of nowhere. So at that point it becomes pretty obvious there's something to this. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to leave the area right now. Which is what I did. And usually if I see a Bigfoot track, I stay there and photograph it. I don't go run away. So that was my reaction to the first time I ever saw anything like that. And I had already, heard that they were supposed to have been in that area. I just kind of blew it off. I was like, yeah, well, you got ghosts and Bigfoot and everything all lives in this area. Yeah, right, whatever. But then you run into something like that and you just, it's like you start going, okay, well, I need to quit being stupid and start actually listening to what these locals are telling me, because they're trying to give me useful advice here, and I'm just like blowing it off, not paying attention to it.
Yeah, and I think some of that mining activity must go into, where their hiding spots are. And do you kind of notice that those old mining places are abandoned and that people leave their stuff there and take off? It's like they don't take any of their equipment or nothing. Even those, like I was looking at some old interior of an old cabin and stuff like that, and I noticed that people didn't even, they left some of their clothes and all kinds of stuff there. Like
yeah,
they had
things
to
you wouldn't think
hurry.
that they just abandoned. Things that, if you were just going to move, you'd take it with you. You wouldn't just leave it there.
Yeah, or throw it away,
Yeah.
And there was even some that I seen somebody's like Levi jacket and a hat. It looked like a cowboy hat and some tools on the wall. Like they left in such a hurry that they left their everyday clothing behind.
The ghost town that I was in doing this research on, they know practically nothing about this. 4 miles away is Garnett, one of the most well-known ghost towns there is. It's well kept up by the Park Service. They know everybody that lived there, how many years they lived there, when they moved there, when they left, who founded the town, when the town pretty much ended, exactly how many ounces of gold they pulled out of the ground, down to the last detail. Okay, 4 miles away from there, on the same stagecoach line, is Coloma, about which they know nothing. They don't know who founded it. They don't know when it was founded. They don't know when the town was officially abandoned. They're not sure about pretty much anything about the town. They have a rough idea of how many buildings were there at some point. How can they know all that information about one town and another one 4 miles away? They know nothing about it, and they're from the same time period. That makes no sense at all. And then the Coloma, the rumor there is that the mines had actually been collapsed on purpose and that they had Chinese in there who had been workers on the railroad. And when the railroads were done and they had put all the railroads in, they got the Chinese workers in there to work in the mine, and the mine was getting pretty close to being played out. So instead of paying them the last paycheck, they just collapsed the mine on top of them. And this mine had the mine had been dug, and the town had been built on top of where the mine was. And this is right next to where there was an Indian burial ground before they decided to make a mine there. So it's like really bad juju on top of really bad juju on top of really bad juju. And, and then it seems like when stuff like that start happening, then you start getting all these weird cryptids attracted to this area, and they all start showing up. We had ghost phenomenon while we were there. We definitely had Bigfoot phenomenon. And, so it's just like, this is, I don't know if is too much tragedy opens a portal, or if, there's just like something that attracts them to these areas. It seems like you see a lot of Bigfoot sightings out of old abandoned towns, old abandoned buildings, old abandoned farms with barns, graveyards even. What does attract a Bigfoot to a graveyard? But they will quite often see sightings of somebody just driving by on the road and there's a graveyard. No, there's a Bigfoot standing in it. So what is that all about? So there's things about these things that we definitely don't know. And, I think the more information that we can get on them without offending them and making them come and yell at us, the better, the better for all concerned. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we get going here?
I guess that would be that people need to be careful when they're around like rocks or rocky areas. You don't want to, have one of these things follow you home. And they're also, I want to say they revealed themselves to kids, younger kids, and that there should be a warning about that stuff. These people that go, tourists mainly, they just let their kids run all over the place, and they don't watch them.
Have you listened to very much of the Missing 411 stuff that Dave Pilates has done? Done a lot of interviews and stuff.
I have all the books. I've read.
Okay.
I've read all pretty much.
So the three number one spots where people go missing from. One is big areas with rock slides and stuff like that, and that's what you're just referencing right there. The second one would be swamps, and the third one would be berry patches. So given that there isn't really a food source other than digging prairie dogs or woodchucks or marmots or something out of holes in between the rocks, there isn't really a ready food source in these big rock fields. And you not only hear about the little people being connected to them, the Pedros, but you also hear connections for some of the more aggressive and nasty varieties of Bigfoot being attracted and somehow frequenting these areas. And that goes to legend all the way up into Alaska, where they talk about that sort of thing. And, it just makes me wonder what the whole weird attraction for these big, rocky fields are, talus slopes and rock slides and things like that. What attracts them to them, and how many of the people that have disappeared in these locations may have actually fallen prey to the Pedros. Yeah,
and actually in that book, the 411, the Western version, we have a couple of our tribal members listed in there.
Oh,
A little kid who probably disappeared like maybe about 40 miles from where I live. And then the other one was in that same general area where the top of the mountain where those things were. But they killed the guy, and then they brought his body back. And
Whoa.
They put it back in that same place where there was a camp there where everything was done, and that it was only a few yards from that camp, and people were camping right on top of that area where they found his body. I mean, like tents and stuff. You cannot. Something took it, killed him, took him, and then several years later brought him back. And then another tribal member found his a weapon that he had, a gun, and then part of his blade. They folded his clothes a certain way, and I thought that was weird.
That's the other weird detail you hear, where some of these people disappear and there's that neat little pile of their clothing laying there, and that's the last thing you ever see of them.
Yeah. Anyway, that happened there. And then the other one was, this is a little girl that lived, this was, I think, I want to say 1958, or it's in the Montana section. Some like maybe 60s, might have been the 60s. But anyway, she called it a bear, and she sprained her ankle, or I mean her arm, so she had a little sling on it, and they were camping at Sage Creek, which is that Custer National Forest, and they were camping there. There was other families camping there and their family, and there was an outhouse there, and she told her mom, and I'm going to say, I can't remember how old that little girl is, but anyways, she went to the outhouse, which wasn't even that far from their camping spot, and then she never came back. And her mom went, her dad, the whole camp started looking for that little girl. And because she had that arm sling that she would, any kid running around there, they knew she hurt her arm, so that she was wearing that thing. And they could not find her anywhere, so they freaked out. They went to the ranger station, which in those days still had rangers. They don't do that stuff anymore.
Yeah.
And they drove there, and it was only maybe a mile away, the ranger station. And so there was a ranger there 24/7, and he had a telephone and something else. Anyways, to contact the authorities. So they had Yellowstone County and Carbon County, I think, come over there pretty quick, and they just went on a big search party. Anyway, one of the searchers found her on the other side of that creek. On both sides is a big mountain, and she was found under a tree, and that little girl was sleeping there, and that she had some kind of bright colored shirt on or something. That's how that searcher seen it. And then anyway, they finally found her, and that they brought her back to that staging area, and then they took her to the hospital and that little girl said that bear gave me a ride on his arm, and that we were walking around all night, and I finally got tired and went to sleep, and that thing was holding her, walking around that, going up and down that mountain. But those searchers surrounded that thing, and so he had to put that little girl down to take off himself. And I think he knew they all had guns. That thing knew they had guns. So she was lucky to be alive.
Man, I guess.
From where I live. And so there's a lot of creepy areas in these mountains around here. and that story is in that 411 book. And wow. That's the first thing I did was read the Montana one first in Wyoming. See where all these, and then I kind of noticed that a lot of those people just aren't watchful of their surroundings, Let kids just take off running or go anywhere. You can't just turn kids loose, especially in the mountains or in an isolated area. Even in your own house, if you live out in the country, You have to know where everyone's at all times to be safe, because there are monsters around and nobody seems to believe that, but they are there.
Yeah, nobody believes it until they run into one, and then it's too late. Say, speaking of other monsters that are around, you want to talk about the extra large birds that live on the edge of the mountains over there?
Oh yeah, they're in our language they're called the birds that take the kids, the children. And I remember my grandmother used to that bird was like the boogeyman to me. If I didn't listen, that bird was going to grab me. And so she would make me be real quiet, because she said they can hear you, especially crying babies and stuff. Crying kids, pouting kids. Seems like they're after them, but I think it's to kind of control the kids from getting too loud, and making kind of dangerous for, the whole village. That was one of the things that they, you don't want your enemies to know where you're at, because your kids are making a racket.
Yeah.
Babies knew how to be quiet in the teepee days, and that's how my grandmother taught me. And there's actually a rock over there in that same Custer National Forest. There's a rock that looks kind of like a pterodactyl, and I kind of I thought that's what they were pterodactyls, but now I think I seen a picture in the Smithsonian with a big black bird, and that was huge. And then I seen, I think it was Unsolved Mysteries on TV, and I seen a little white kid. I think it was in Pennsylvania or Ohio, I can't remember, but one of those two states. They were two little boys playing outside in broad daylight, and a great big blackbird grabbed that one kid by the shoulders and was dragging him off, flying off with him. That little boy screamed for that kid's mom, and that kid's mom ran out and beat the heck out of it with a broom or something, some kind of stick, and it dropped her son. But that thing took off, and they never ever had any. And then I thought, hey, that's what my grandmother was talking about. And that they roost in those cliffs. And that they do come out at night. I know that. And my daughter has seen one in broad daylight flying. And then my cousin's kids seen one flying in broad daylight too. They're like, look at how big that bird is. And I think my son said they seen one, but it was getting starting to get dark when they seen it. And they couldn't really tell how big it was, but it looked like a huge bird, like as big as a car.
I know what you're talking about with that one Smithsonian bird. They actually got part of the skeleton of it and made a reconstruction of it. I believe it's called Pterothornis. It's sort of like a cross between an eagle and a condor, a gigantic sort of square-looking wings. They're figuring sort of a blackish-looking bird. Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder, first of all, if that's where the legend of the Thunderbird came from, if it was the Pterothornis that they were seeing, these extra huge-sized birds. And a bird that big, I mean, out on the plains or around the mountains or something, it could ride thermals all day long. Wouldn't hardly have to flap its wings ever. It could just sit up there in the sky. And then the other thing is that you just mentioned, my God, if these things are night hunters, well, God knows what they could be getting away with, because we wouldn't know that they'd be around. Who would be seeing one flying around at night? I mean, unless it was like a starlit night or a moonlit night or something, you'd never see it. It's got black feathers.
Yeah. And my daughter is the one that was talking about it. And then my son, he was around there. He doesn't live with us, but he said, I think I seen one of those things when he was going home from my house at night, because when he visits, he just hangs around there until, at night, or he likes to go in the mountains a lot. And so he, goes home at night with his family, and then he noticed that thing kind of went, it wasn't right, he couldn't see it because of the car headlight, the car headlights. It was right above it, and he knew that it was a big bird. And then he said, I think I seen that thing.
Jeez.
And this had to have been like about maybe 9, and it seemed like it was in the fall or something. I'll have to ask my daughter when it was not too long after she seen her sighting. And then I'm not sure, then my aunt told me that her nephew's son's seen it, and it was way over there, right where there's just wheat fields and stuff. And they were like driving along, and then they kind of turned around and they thought it was like one of those small planes that do kind of like farm stuff,
crop dusting or something.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. They kind of looked at it and they thought, man, that ain't no plane, that's a bird.
Really.
And they all
bird.
started looking at it and almost ran off the road, I guess, to drive her. And so
Probably be my reaction too. I'd be so busy watching it, I'd go in the ditch.
yeah. One of them yelled out, "You're gonna wreck us!" And so, but one of them was really watching it. But they said they wish they had binoculars to really look at the head part and see what it was. They couldn't tell what it was. They said it kind of looked like a hawk face, a hawk head kind, but it was huge, like a giant hawk.
Wow.
But it was black. And I thought, man, those things must be coming out during broad daylight now. And that area, that area where they roost, it's like a great big face of a mountain. You can't just drive up there. If you do climb up there, you'd have to do rock climbing to get up to it. It's kind of like a real steep. And then there's timber all around it. On the bottom part of it, it's all timber. And one of my cousins I was telling her about those birds at that place. And I said, you can see that there's rocks that the shape of one of those birds is there. And I can't remember if I took a picture. I think I did take a picture, but my phone crashed and I didn't get a chance to download it.
Oh.
Which really bugged me. And that was last year. I took that picture last year. Because we just went up for a drive. We went into that Custer National Forest, and it's really pretty there. And
it used to interest me when you'd see some of the old stories, especially coming off the plains, or the plains tribes would talk about them, and they'd say that they would show up. They called them Thunderbirds because they'd show up along with storms. And I always thought about that. If the storm's coming across the plains, it's got that huge updraft in front of it. If you're just going to be a giant gliding bird, how awesome would that be to just ride that wave in front of the storm? You could go as far as you wanted to without flapping your wing. That's really creepy. Here comes a big storm. Let's take cover. The giant birds are out. Oh my God. No, thank you.
That's how my grandma used to tell me to behave myself and not make any kind of noises because of that bird.
Could you tell us what the bird's name was?
No, it's in my language and I can't say it.
Okay.
It's another one of those bad things.
Can you tell us what the English version of it would be?
I would just say Thunderbird would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're talking about the same critter as a Thunderbird, basically.
Yeah.
I was just curious if you could tell us the actual name that your tribe had for it.
Yeah.
Well, that's always been interesting to me. That's something you hardly ever hear about, too, and that's, again, thanks for bringing up that, and I'm glad that I remembered to actually mention it. And, and again, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge and your family's interactions with the Pedros. Definitely something for people to be aware of, that if you see giant footprints, you maybe want to leave the area, but if you see tiny, tiny footprints, you definitely want to leave the area, and like right now.
Yeah.
And so again, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on the show, Sue. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, or shout out to any friends, or anything else that you want to bring up?
No, I'm giving this interview because I want to warn people that there's dangers out there, and you need to watch yourself where you're out and about, and watch your kids.
Well, I totally agree with that. And as you probably know from listening to my shows, that's what I'm all about. I want to let people know that these things are real. They may not be common, but they do exist, and potentially you could run into one if you go in the wrong place at the wrong time. So better to know what it is that you might have to deal with, or better yet, how to avoid ever running into it and having to deal with it, which is the optimal situation. But that requires knowing about it, so you know where to not go and when not to be there, so you don't run into one. So it's super important to have people like Sue here that will come on and talk about these things and give the sort of information that some of the people have actually managed to put together on these things, but are not usually willing to share with others. And so I really, really appreciate that from the bottom of my heart. That's why I'm in this too. You know, I had a bad encounter when I was 10, and it just turned my whole life upside down. And I don't want to see anybody else have that happen to them, or even potentially worse situation, get killed, just disappear, never be seen again. You know, and that's in my mind every day. Every day I'm worried that could be somebody out there having that happen to them. And if I can stop that from happening to even one person, it's worth all of the effort that I put into doing these shows. So that's where I'm at with it. So again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for coming on the show, Sue, and sharing your encounters and your family's traditions and stuff with us. Just spectacular, and really appreciate it.